Did you ever bump into him when you
Bump into him?
Yeah, not on television. You know?
No, he used to sit down at the end of the bar on my last show at 3 in the morning. And my joke is, I make fun of people, and I'd say, there's a black gentleman sitting there, and that black gentleman, blah, blah. And Carson would get up from the bar and go.
Johnny Carson was the king of late night, known for his quick wit and effortless charm. He could make almost any guest feel welcome, turning interviews into legendary TV moments. But not everyone was easy to talk to. Some guests tested his patience, clashed with his style, or made things downright uncomfortable. Tonight, we're looking at the moments when Carson's smooth hosting was put to the test, featuring some of the most awkward and frustrating encounters in Tonight Show history. Bob Hope was a comedy legend, but when it came to The Tonight Show, he wasn't exactly Carson's favorite guest. Unlike most visitors who thrived on spontaneous banter, Hope stuck to a rigid script, relying heavily on pre-written jokes and cue cards. Every punchline was rehearsed, every exchange carefully planned, leaving little room for the natural flow Carson preferred. Instead of a lively back and forth, their interviews felt more like a staged performance, one that Carson had little control over. Hope's team would even send over topics and jokes in advance, expecting Carson to play the role of a set-up man rather than an engaged interviewer. Over time, it became clear that these appearances weren't about conversation. They were about promoting whatever Hope was working on at the time. Carson, known for his effortless ability to guide interviews, found it tedious. He once joked that interviewing Hope was like talking to a walking press release, a clear sign of his growing frustration. Joan Rivers was once one of Johnny Carson's favorite guests. Sharp, fearless, and always quick with a joke, she became a regular on The Tonight Show and even served as Carson's go-to guest host. For years, it seemed like she was being groomed as his successor. But in 1986, everything changed. Rivers accepted an offer to host her own late-night show on Fox, a groundbreaking move that made her the first woman to do so. The problem? She never told Carson. When the news broke, he felt blindsided, seeing it as a deep personal betrayal. Despite all their years of friendship and professional collaboration, Carson never spoke to her again. He refused to take her calls, cut off all contact, and even banned her from The Tonight Show entirely. The ban remained in place long after he retired, upheld by Jay Leno out of respect for Carson. It wasn't until 2014, nearly 3 decades later, that Rivers finally returned to The Tonight Show stage, long after Carson's reign had ended. Wayne Newton was a Las Vegas icon, known for his smooth voice and larger-than-life stage presence. But to Johnny Carson, he was also the perfect target for a running joke. Carson often poked fun at Newton's flamboyant style, polished appearance, and high-pitched voice. While many celebrities laughed off Carson's playful teasing, Newton didn't see the humor in it. He took the jokes personally, and as the years went on, the mockery only became more pointed. Newton, proud of his success and reputation, wasn't willing to be the butt of the joke any longer. One day, Newton decided he'd had enough. Rather than trade insults on air, he confronted Carson directly, off camera, in person. According to multiple reports, Newton stormed into Carson's office, visibly angry, and demanded that the jokes stop. But this wasn't just a heated conversation. Newton allegedly used his physical presence to make his point clear. Some accounts suggest that the meeting turned into an outright intimidation attempt, with Newton making it known that there would be consequences if the jokes didn't end. For Carson, who was known for his sharp wit, but not for physical confrontation, this was one of the rare moments when he felt genuinely outmatched. While he had made a career out of playfully needling guests and celebrities, this time it wasn't just a harmless gag. It had turned into something real. Whether it was fear or simply the realization that the situation had escalated too far, Carson reportedly backed down. After that encounter, his jokes about Newton became noticeably less frequent, if not completely absent. The tension between the two never fully disappeared, and their relationship remained strained. Unlike other feuds that fizzled out over time, this one left a lasting impact. Newton wasn't just another celebrity who played along with Carson's humor. He was one of the few who fought back, and in doing so, left an impression that Carson wouldn't forget. Fred Rogers was a television icon, beloved for his gentle voice, kind heart, and unwavering sincerity. His show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, encouraged children to embrace kindness, empathy, and self-worth. But when he stepped onto the set of The Tonight Show, he entered a world very different from his own. Johnny Carson thrived on sharp wit, playful teasing, and comedic spontaneity, things that didn't quite align with Rogers' soft-spoken, deeply earnest nature. It wasn't that Carson disliked Rogers personally, but their styles couldn't have been more different. Carson was a master at poking fun at his guests in a way that made the audience laugh without causing offense. But how do you joke with a man like Fred Rogers? He wasn't an actor promoting a film, a comedian trading barbs, or a musician with a wild story to tell. He was simply himself, genuine, warm, and unshakably kind. There was no ego, no bravado, no pretense, and that left Carson in a tricky spot. Teasing Rogers too much could make Carson seem mean-spirited, but treating the interview too seriously could make it feel flat. The result? Some of the most awkward interviews in Tonight Show history. Carson, usually in full control, seemed unsure of how to steer the conversation. He would attempt to engage Rogers with light humor, but instead of playing along, Rogers would answer with complete sincerity, often shifting the discussion toward messages of kindness and childhood education. The late-night audience, expecting laughter and quick wit, was instead met with slow, heartfelt reflections. Valuable, yes, but not quite the entertainment they had tuned in for. To his credit, Carson remained professional and respectful, recognizing the impact Rogers had on millions. But it was clear that this wasn't the kind of guest that fit naturally within The Tonight Show's fast-paced comedic atmosphere. It was like placing a philosopher in a stand-up comedy club, thoughtful and important, but completely out of place. Rogers' rare appearances on the show left an undeniable impression, not just on the audience, but on Carson himself. It wasn't hostility or dislike, just an undeniable clash of two television legends whose worlds simply didn't align. Charlton Heston was a Hollywood legend, known for his commanding screen presence and larger-than-life roles in epics like Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments. But when it came to The Tonight Show, his serious, grandiose personality didn't quite mesh with Johnny Carson's quick-witted conversational style. Heston approached interviews the same way he approached his film roles, with a sense of formality and importance that made it difficult for Carson to create an engaging back and forth. Carson excelled at keeping the energy light, weaving humor into conversations no matter the guest. But with Heston, that was nearly impossible. Instead of breezy banter, he often delivered long, drawn-out answers filled with self-importance and gravitas. Every question seemed to turn into a speech, making it hard for Carson to keep the pacing lively. Instead of a fun, entertaining interview, it often felt like a lecture, one that Carson had to sit through rather than steer. It wasn't that Heston was an unlikable guest, but he simply didn't fit the rhythm of The Tonight Show. Carson, who thrived on spontaneity and wit, seemed to struggle whenever Heston took the stage. Jokes would land awkwardly, moments of humor would pass unacknowledged, and Carson was left searching for ways to inject life into the conversation. what should have been an entertaining exchange felt more like a formal press conference, something that Carson likely found exhausting. While he always remained professional, it was clear that Heston's visits were more of a chore than a joy for Carson. Their styles clashed too much, one a master of unscripted, light-hearted fun, the other a man who treated every moment as if it were a dramatic monologue. Chevy Chase was one of the biggest comedy stars to emerge from Saturday Night Live, but when he sat down with Johnny Carson, something always felt off. Unlike most comedians who came on The Tonight Show eager to engage in playful banter, Chase often carried an air of superiority, as if he was above the late-night format. His smug attitude and condescending humor didn't sit well with Carson, who valued charm, humility, and a natural sense of comedic timing. Carson, a veteran of late-night television, had hosted countless stars, but Chase was different. Instead of playing along with Carson's rhythm, he often came off as dismissive or uninterested. His humor relied heavily on sarcasm, deadpan delivery, and an almost aloof detachment, which clashed with Carson's warmth and ability to make any conversation feel effortless. Rather than a smooth back and forth, their interactions felt tense, with Carson seemingly unsure whether Chase was joking or just being difficult. The awkwardness only grew as Chase's career took off. He was rumored to have ambitions of taking over The Tonight Show one day, a possibility that may have put him in direct competition with Carson. Whether real or perceived, this unspoken rivalry added an edge to their interactions. Carson, while never outwardly confrontational, had little patience for arrogance, and Chase's demeanor often disrupted the natural flow of the show. While some guests elevated Carson's humor, Chase's appearances often did the opposite. Instead of sparking lively conversation, his presence seemed to drag the energy down, leaving Carson and the audience waiting for the interview to be over. It wasn't a full-blown feud, but there was an undeniable discomfort, a clash of styles and personalities that made for some of the most stilted and uneasy moments in Tonight Show history. Frank Sinatra was one of the biggest names in entertainment, a living legend whose presence demanded attention. But when he appeared on The Tonight Show, his larger-than-life persona didn't always mix well with Johnny Carson's structured, polished hosting style. Sinatra had a habit of doing things his way, whether it fit the show's format or not. One of the most famous examples was when he unexpectedly walked onto the stage during Carson's monologue, completely throwing off the rhythm of the show. Carson was a master at maintaining control, keeping the flow of the show smooth no matter what happened. But with Sinatra, that was a challenge. Unlike other guests who respected the setup of late-night television, Sinatra sometimes acted as if the rules didn't apply to him. He could be dismissive, interrupt conversations, and even take over segments with little regard for how it affected the pacing. His status as Hollywood royalty meant that few people pushed back, but Carson wasn't a fan of having the spotlight wrestled away from him. While Carson respected Sinatra's legacy, it was clear that hosting him was not always an easy task. Sinatra's presence, though exciting for audiences, often disrupted the carefully curated flow of The Tonight Show. Their interactions, while professional, carried an underlying tension, Carson always trying to maintain balance, while Sinatra, intentionally or not, made it nearly impossible. Shelley Winters was an undeniable talent, a two-time Academy Award-winning actress with a career spanning decades. But when she appeared on The Tonight Show, she was less of a guest and more of a force of nature. Loud, unpredictable, and always ready to take over the conversation, Winters often left Johnny Carson struggling to keep the interview on track. Unlike other guests who played along with Carson's rhythm, she bulldozed right through it, turning every appearance into a whirlwind of chaotic energy. Carson, who thrived on a smooth and controlled interview style, often found himself barely able to get a word in. Winters would interrupt, veer off topic, and go on long animated tangents, leaving Carson visibly frustrated. She had a habit of dominating conversations, talking over him, and completely ignoring the structure of the show. It made for unpredictable television, sometimes hilarious, sometimes exhausting, and always a challenge for Carson. One of her most infamous moments came when she abruptly removed her shoe and handed it to Carson in the middle of an interview. Completely out of context, and with no explanation, it was classic Shelley Winters, erratic and unfiltered. Carson, visibly exasperated, took the shoe but struggled to regain control of the segment. It was moments like these that made Winters both an entertaining and frustrating guest. Someone who was guaranteed to bring energy, but not necessarily the kind that Carson preferred. While Carson remained professional, it was clear that Winters tested his patience more than most. Her unpredictable antics, overpowering presence, and refusal to let the host guide the conversation made her one of the most difficult guests to manage. Whether audiences found her appearances entertaining or overwhelming, one thing was certain. Whenever Shelley Winters was on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson had his work cut out for him. Don Rickles was a comedy legend, the undisputed king of insult humor, and one of The Tonight Show's most unpredictable guests. Unlike other comedians who played off Carson's wit with mutual respect, Rickles came in swinging, firing off relentless jabs at everyone in the room, especially Carson. While Johnny could take a joke, Rickles had a way of pushing things just a little too far, making their interviews feel more like comedic battlegrounds than friendly conversations. Rickles thrived on chaos, and whenever he was on set, The Tonight Show became his playground. He ignored traditional interview structure, cutting off Carson mid-sentence, throwing out rapid-fire insults, and constantly shifting the energy to revolve around him. It made for hilarious television, but it also visibly tested Carson's patience. Unlike other guests who let Carson steer the conversation, Rickles would hijack it completely, turning the host into the butt of the joke more often than not. One of their most infamous moments happened when Rickles guest hosted The Tonight Show in Carson's absence. At some point during the show, Rickles managed to break Carson's cigarette box, a small but symbolic part of his desk. When Carson returned the next night and discovered the damage, he didn't let it slide. He stormed onto the set of CPO Sharkey, the sitcom Rickles was filming at the time, and confronted him in front of the live audience. It was a rare moment where Carson flipped the script, putting Rickles in the hot seat. Despite the occasional tension, there was genuine admiration between the two. Carson knew that Rickles' humor was all in good fun, even if it occasionally left him exasperated. But there was no denying that Rickles was one of the few guests who truly threw Carson off his game. His wild, uncontrollable energy made for some of the funniest, most uncomfortable, and most unforgettable moments in Tonight Show history. Zsa Zsa Gabor was the definition of old Hollywood glamour, charming, extravagant, and completely unpredictable. But when she appeared on The Tonight Show, she had a tendency to take over, leaving Johnny Carson struggling to keep the conversation on track. Known for her love of luxury, Gabor would steer every interview toward stories about her wealth, lavish lifestyle, and long list of high-profile romances. No matter what Carson asked, the conversation always seemed to circle back to her, making it difficult for him to maintain control. Adding to the chaos was Gabor's over-the-top flirtation with Carson. While some playful banter was common on late-night television, Gabor took it to another level, often turning interviews into extended, exaggerated attempts at seduction. What was meant to be light-hearted fun often turned awkward, with Carson visibly unsure of how to respond without making the moment even more uncomfortable. Despite her undeniable charm, Gabor's larger-than-life personality made her a challenging guest. Carson, who thrived on balance and quick-witted exchanges, often found himself sidelined as Gabor dominated the stage. While her appearances were never dull, they were also some of the most unpredictable, leaving Carson visibly exasperated as he tried, and often failed, to keep the show on course. Norman Mailer was a brilliant writer, but as a guest on The Tonight Show, he was anything but easy. Known for his fiery personality and love of debate, Mailer approached interviews like intellectual sparring matches rather than casual conversations. While Carson was a master at keeping things light and entertaining, Mailer seemed more interested in challenging ideas, often steering discussions into serious and confrontational territory. Carson, who preferred quick-witted guests that could match his humor, found Mailer's long-winded, self-important answers exhausting. Instead of engaging in playful banter, Mailer would go off on philosophical tangents, turning a simple question into a drawn-out monologue. His tendency to dominate conversations left Carson visibly frustrated, struggling to regain control of the interview before it spiraled into yet another lecture. Unlike most guests who embraced Carson's comedic rhythm, Mailer rarely played along. His intense demeanor and refusal to lighten up clashed with The Tonight Show's late-night atmosphere. While Carson remained professional, it was clear that Mailer's appearances were more of a chore than a pleasure, an uncomfortable clash between two men who had entirely different ideas of what made for great television. Tony Curtis was a Hollywood legend, but when he sat down with Johnny Carson, the spotlight wasn't something he was willing to share. Instead of engaging in a natural conversation, Curtis had a habit of hijacking interviews, launching into long, self-indulgent stories about his career, often without much prompting. While Carson was skilled at keeping discussions lively and balanced, Curtis's larger-than-life persona made that nearly impossible. Curtis thrived on theatrics, often turning interviews into one-man performances rather than back-and-forth exchanges. His tendency to talk at length about his own success without much room for humor or spontaneity clashed with Carson's preference for light-hearted banter. Instead of playful dialogue, Carson found himself trying to steer an interview that had quickly become a personal monologue. Though Curtis was undoubtedly entertaining, his self-importance often overshadowed the fun, leaving Carson visibly struggling to keep things moving. Rather than an engaging guest, he often felt more like an unstoppable act in need of an intermission. Harry Belafonte was a legendary singer, actor, and activist, but his appearances on The Tonight Show often took a more serious turn than Johnny Carson was comfortable with. While Carson respected Belafonte's work and his dedication to civil rights, their interviews frequently veered away from entertainment and into deep political discussions. Rather than engaging in light banter or humorous storytelling, Belafonte would steer the conversation toward race, inequality, and social justice, topics that, while important, didn't always fit the tone of a late-night talk show. Carson, who prided himself on maintaining a relaxed and entertaining atmosphere, often appeared uneasy during these moments. He wasn't known for tackling controversial or politically charged subjects, preferring to keep things fun and escapist for his audience. With Belafonte, that wasn't always an option. While their discussions were always thoughtful and respectful, there was a visible tension, Carson trying to redirect the conversation, Belafonte staying firm in his message. It was a dynamic that made for compelling television, but left Carson struggling to keep The Tonight Show within its usual comfort zone. Tom Snyder was a seasoned broadcaster known for his deep, commanding voice and intense interview style. But when he was on The Tonight Show, he had a habit that frustrated Johnny Carson. He wouldn't stop talking. As a fellow late-night host, Snyder was used to being the one asking the questions, but when the roles were reversed, he struggled to let Carson take control. Instead of following the natural flow of the conversation, Snyder often dominated discussions, turning his guest spot into his own personal segment. Carson, a master of pacing and balance, found Snyder's approach disruptive. His confrontational style, while effective in his own interviews, clashed with The Tonight Show's easygoing atmosphere. What was meant to be a relaxed and entertaining exchange often felt more like a monologue, with Snyder steering the conversation wherever he pleased. For a host like Carson, who thrived on keeping things sharp and dynamic, interviewing Snyder could be a chore. It was one of the rare times where Carson, usually in complete control, was left waiting for a chance to speak. Burt Reynolds was one of Hollywood's biggest stars, and his appearances on The Tonight Show were always lively. But beneath the laughs, there was a tension that never fully disappeared. Reynolds had a habit of teasing Carson in ways that sometimes went a little too far. Whether it was jabs about Carson's personal life or playful digs that bordered on uncomfortable, their exchanges often carried an underlying competitiveness that made their interactions feel unpredictable. While their on-screen banter was usually lighthearted, there were moments where the tension between them became more apparent. Carson, who was always quick with a comeback, wasn't used to being on the receiving end of relentless ribbing, and Reynolds wasn't afraid to push his limits. At times, what should have been friendly teasing felt like a subtle battle for dominance. One of their most famous moments came in the form of an all-out pie fight, an unexpectedly chaotic segment that perfectly captured their love-hate relationship. It was messy, hilarious, and symbolic of the playful rivalry between them. Though they never truly disliked each other, Carson's interactions with Reynolds always had an edge, making for some of The Tonight Show's most unpredictable and entertaining moments. Muhammad Ali was more than just a boxing legend. He was a showman, a force of nature, and one of the most charismatic figures to ever sit across from Johnny Carson. But Ali's larger-than-life personality often made it difficult for Carson to keep control of the conversation. Unlike most guests who allowed Carson to guide the interview, Ali took over the moment he walked on stage, launching into bold declarations, playful trash talk, and unpredictable storytelling. Carson, known for his smooth and calculated hosting style, often found himself struggling to keep up. Ali's energy was relentless, his confidence unmatched, and his ability to command attention left little room for Carson to steer the discussion the way he usually did. Where Carson thrived on balance and comedic timing, Ali thrived on dominance, making their interactions feel more like a performance than an interview. Though Carson respected Ali's wit and charm, their contrasting styles created a dynamic where Carson often played the role of spectator rather than host. While Ali's appearances were undeniably entertaining, they also left Carson with the rare challenge of being upstaged on his own show. Oliver Reed was a talented actor, but when he appeared on talk shows, he was just as well known for his unpredictable, often wild behavior. With a reputation for drinking before interviews and embracing chaos, he made for an unpredictable guest, one that even Johnny Carson struggled to manage. Unlike most celebrities who respected the show's structure, Reed seemed to thrive on disrupting it, often speaking over Carson, veering off topic, or simply behaving erratically. Carson, who was always in control of his interviews, looked visibly uncomfortable during Reed's appearances. While he could usually steer a difficult conversation with humor or quick wit, Reed's unpredictable nature made that nearly impossible. Whether it was slurred speech, outlandish stories, or outright rowdiness, Carson found himself in the rare position of being unable to rein in a guest. While Reed's antics may have entertained some audiences, for Carson, managing an unpredictable and unruly guest like him was more of a challenge than a comedy act. Richard Pryor was one of the greatest comedians of all time, raw, unfiltered, and completely unpredictable. But his brand of humor didn't always align with Johnny Carson's more polished, mainstream approach. While Carson thrived on wit and careful timing, Pryor was a whirlwind of energy, often pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable on television. His comedy was honest, edgy, and sometimes uncomfortable, which didn't always fit neatly into The Tonight Show's traditional format. Carson, who preferred a controlled interview setting, often found himself struggling to keep up. Pryor would jump from one thought to another, making wild observations and going off on tangents that left Carson scrambling to regain control. Unlike guests who played along with Carson's rhythm, Pryor dictated his own pace, sometimes leaving Carson with little room to steer the conversation. Though their interactions were never hostile, there was an undeniable tension. Two comedy giants, with very different styles, occasionally clashing on air. While their interviews were always entertaining, it was clear that Pryor's fearless, no-holds-barred comedy wasn't always an easy fit for Carson's late-night world. Orson Welles was a cinematic genius, a larger-than-life figure whose presence commanded attention. But when he sat down with Johnny Carson, his grand storytelling style often turned the interview into a one-man show. Welles had a tendency to speak in long, dramatic monologues, weaving intricate tales with no regard for pacing. Instead of engaging in a natural back and forth, he would launch into theatrical speeches that left Carson struggling to keep the energy of the show moving. Carson, who thrived on quick exchanges and snappy humor, often found himself sidelined. He would ask a simple question, only to receive an elaborate, drawn-out response that seemed more suited for a stage performance than a talk show. While Welles's stories were undeniably fascinating, they slowed the momentum of the interview, leaving Carson with little opportunity to guide the conversation. Though Carson respected Welles's brilliance, their interactions revealed a clear disconnect. Welles approached interviews like a grand production, while Carson aimed for effortless, engaging television. The result was often a beautifully told but overly long segment that tested Carson's patience and the audience's attention span. Robin Williams was a comedic whirlwind, a force of nature who could turn any conversation into a rapid-fire stream of impressions, jokes, and spontaneous bits. His mind worked at lightning speed, jumping from one thought to the next with barely a pause, leaving even the quickest hosts struggling to keep up. Johnny Carson, known for his ability to control the flow of an interview, often found himself simply along for the ride whenever Williams took the stage. Carson clearly admired Williams's genius, but their interviews were more chaotic than structured. Carson would start with a question, only for Williams to take off on an unpredictable tangent, bouncing between voices, characters, and surreal anecdotes. It was entertaining, but it also left Carson with little room to steer the conversation or regain control. While their dynamic was never tense, it was clear that Williams's relentless energy could be exhausting. Carson, a master of timing and restraint, had to adapt to a style that was anything but predictable. Their interviews were unforgettable, but for Carson, they were also some of the most unpredictable and overwhelming moments in Tonight Show history. Johnny Carson was the king of late night, a master of smooth, effortless conversation. But even he had guests who threw him off balance. Some were too rehearsed, others too unpredictable, and a few simply took over, leaving Carson struggling to regain control. Whether it was larger-than-life personalities, awkward tension, or relentless self-promotion, these guests disrupted the careful rhythm he worked so hard to maintain. Through it all, Carson remained professional, handling even the most difficult interviews with wit and composure. But the moments when he lost control, when the show veered into chaos or frustration, became some of the most unforgettable in Tonight Show history. Now, we want to hear from you. Which of these guests do you think gave Carson the hardest time? Or was there someone even worse that we missed? Let us know in the comments below.